Welcome to the B'nai B'rith International podcast. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thanks for spending some time with us today. One brief reminder, check out our video interview series, Conversations with B'nai B'rith, on Facebook and YouTube. You'll find discussions with historians, diplomats, Middle East experts, even an astronaut, an NFL player, and a legendary DJ. Watch our latest content by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and liking us on Facebook at B'nai B'rith International. The name Issachar Zacharie doesn't usually ring a bell, even for most American historians. Even fewer know he was more than just the preeminent foot doctor for political elites, including President Abraham Lincoln in the 19th century. But in recent years, Zachary has gone from mostly forgotten American Civil War era figure to becoming more widely known as an important person in the Civil War and greater American history, as none other than Lincoln's wartime secret agent. Dr. Ernest Abel, author of the book Lincoln's Jewish Spy, The Life and Times of Issachar Zacharie, is here with me to delve into Zachary's incredible life story as a doctor who treated the likes of Henry Clay and General George McClellan. He was President Lincoln's confidant, and he was an unlikely Union agent. A doctor, scientist, and Civil War historian, Dr. Abel is professor emeritus at Wayne State University in Detroit. He had joint appointments as full professor in the departments of obstetrics and gynecology and psychology. Dr. Abel is also the author of more than 40 scholarly and trade books and more than 200 peer-reviewed articles and trade magazine articles on Civil War history, and is a member of the Michigan Civil War Roundtable. Ernest, thank you so much for being here today.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
Well, that's great. Well, based on your medical background and Civil War knowledge, Dr. Zacharie's story must have been intriguing to you. A surgeon in his teens, Zachary acquired knowledge of the treatment of the feet and, at least from what Lincoln wrote, knew how to make his patients better. His reputation was marred, among other reasons, by some shameless self-promotion, but he benefited from powerful connections, it seems, and attained considerable success. And his Civil War activities alone would fill a book, and that's what you've done. What is your perception of him, and how did it change by the time that you completed the manuscript? And maybe perhaps first, what is it that caught your attention about Issachar Zacharie?
Well, I very much was interested in flawed characters. I wrote about John Wilkes Booth before this book, and I noticed in him a flawed character that, of course, resulted in one of the most infamous activities in United States history. And while I was researching that book, I came across some anecdotes about, for one of a better reason, Issachar Zacharie being involved with Lincoln. And I started, I didn't know anything about Zachary, and I started researching him. And the more and more I looked into it, the more I saw some kind of similarities between a guy who was a self-promoter, narcissistic, very involved in himself, and yet in this case, not in Booth's case, but in this case, a guy who didn't need to fudge his credentials. He really was the real thing as far as taking care of feet. He was par excellence, a podiatrist. They used to call it chiropodist. That's the English term. That's still used in England. But he was very, very good at his profession, and he parlayed this into, as you pointed out before, being a physician, or not a physician, but a podiatrist to many of the famous generals in the Civil War, which led him to Lincoln. And Lincoln was a very astute judge of character, and he saw in this guy a flawed character, a guy who seemed to want to make a name for himself, who was very interested in promoting himself, needed to promote himself, and saw in him somebody who might be of use to him in terms of going into the community, building himself up, but at the same time reporting back to Lincoln what he had found. And so they formed a kind of camaraderie. And this led to some of his other activities. So that's kind of a roundabout way of saying that I was interested in him because he is a unusual character in that he wasn't all good and he wasn't all bad. He was, like many of us, a person who had flaws, but also had some of its excellent points.
Well, we're talking about a character going way back into the 19th century. So where did your research take you in your search for more information? Where do you find information about individuals like Zachary, who these were not major figures in history, nor major figures really in Civil War period? So did Zachary leave papers to any archive or institution? How did you find this information?
I found most of the information looking through the papers of General Nathaniel Banks, with whom Zachary at first was a spy for him in New Orleans in the Jewish community. Banks was appointed the military director of the part of the Union occupation in New Orleans. And Lincoln sent Zachary to Banks, telling him he'd be a very good person to have not in his staff, but somewhat in his staff, to report back on what the Jewish community was doing in New Orleans and how they were reacting to the occupation. They formed a kind of a allegiance. It was very unusual because Banks was a very private person, and Zachary was a very outgoing person. But he went in the community. He organized a spy organization for Banks, and sent people into the outer parts of Louisiana and had them report back. And he would then tell Banks what was going on. And at the same time as he was reporting to Banks, he was reporting to Lincoln about Banks. So he was doing a lot of spying and counter spying and finding out information. But Banks left a large repository of letters between Zachary and about Zachary that I found at the Library of Congress, which allowed me to gain insight into his character and his relationships. I had also done a lot of web searching, found out some of the early information about his parentage. Zachary's father was born in what used to be Poland. It was taken over when it was divided between Austria, Germany, and Russia. But Zachary's father still considered himself Poland. He emigrated to England in the early 1800s, wound up in one of the port cities, Chatham, England, which was a shipbuilding area. And he was a peddler there, as many of the Jews who emigrated to England were. He married a local girl there, Amelia Cohen, whose father was a chazan at the local shul. And he sort of became part of the community. And then later on, he moved to the United States with his family. There was a cholera epidemic going on around the 1830s. And after the Napoleonic War, Chatham fell on bad times. So they had economic trouble. So for one reason or another, he left. But what I found was this background information on the Zachary family that I started going back and looking at the records. So that was another source.
So they actually arrived in the United States what year?
I think it was 1832, 35. I can't remember what exact. 1830s.
And you mentioned the connection of a chazan. Was this a family of practicing Jews?
In England, it was, and they were Sephardic. Believe it or not, a guy coming from Poland, a man coming from what used to be Poland, was Sephardic. And although Cohen is usually thought of an Ashkenazi name, was also Sephardic. So they were a Sephardic family. And interesting background on this Sephardic family. Issachar is named after his grandfather, Jonathan's father, and their second son, Jonathan and Amelia's second son, was named after her father. So that sort of followed the patronymics of the Zachariah clan of Sephardic. And then the fact is that Issachar's first name was not Issachar Zacharie, it was Issachar Zachariah Jr. And Ashkenazis don't name their sons juniors, Sephardics do. And so this is, I got really interested in this nomenclature because one of the things that I was very interested in, still am, I was a member of the American Name Society. And names are very, very important and something that I was interested in. So I spent a lot of time tracking down the Zachariah name and this patronymics.
Where did the family arrive at? Where they moved to when they arrived in the United States?
They first came to New York, and they didn't know anybody there, so they went to Philadelphia. And the reason they went to Philadelphia was I believe, and this is, I'm speculating, but the events later on proved that it probably was right. They had some friends from Disan, and they spent time with them. As many of the Jews who would come to any new country, if you found somebody you knew, it was a lot easier to settle in, or if you had family, a lot easier to settle in. So they moved first to Philadelphia. They became part of the Jewish community. Amelia became a dry goods shop owner. Jonathan was a peddler, and so they made a living that way. After a while, they decided to pull up roots and move to Charleston, South Carolina. But just to go back to Philadelphia, that's where Issachar met his future wife in Philadelphia.
Now, you write that Issachar was kind of a wunderkind, a teenager who practiced surgery, and he seemed to do it in a way that made people feel comfortable. Now, I know this is an era in which people oftentimes obtain various procedures from barbers and druggists and others. I mean, how did he do this without going to school?
Well, that's the amazing thing. There was a itinerant podiatrist called Behrens who spent some time in Charleston, and apparently he watched him and he learned the techniques for doing this from Behrens and decided he's going to go in business for himself. And at that time, his parents were well off enough to open a store for him, a shop front. And he started doing procedures on his own there. But at the same time, he started selling patent medicines from the same spot. So he's doing, treating people's feet and also selling them patent medicines, which was, a combination that he kept up for a long time until he just sort of stuck with his podiatry business when that really took off. But he learned pretty much from Behrens and then perfected the techniques himself. He was really a remarkable individual in that he could do these procedures and people bore him out with, removing nails and removing corns and bunions painlessly.
So in a way, he kind of contributed to the development of podiatry in that day.
Yes, very much so. In fact, there's a scholarship named after him at the Pomona Foot Podiatry College. So they keep his memory alive that way.
Tell us more about Zachary's early life, particularly his life in San Francisco, his connection to the Jewish community there.
He, in the wake of the gold rush, he, like many Jews, headed west to San Francisco. He went with his brother, and they originally landed in San Francisco, and then they went to Stockton and set up a dry goods business there. And he became there weren't that many Jews, obviously, in that part of the country. And when he came to San Francisco, there was the first Jewish child born west of the Mississippi. They needed a mohel, and because of his skill with a knife, he was the only one that they could turn to, and they became the mohel for this first child who was born, first Jewish kid who was born in San Francisco. They said later on he moved to Stockton and became a very prominent dry goods owner. He accumulated enough wealth to buy a lot of land. He had an orchard, and from which he would sell fruits. I mean, he apparently tired of living in a small community, so he moved back to San Francisco for a while, set up his practice again, and one of the things that happened to him, he was robbed while he was in San Francisco. Somebody stole all his clothes, and he had no clothes whatsoever except his wife's garments. So he had to put them on, and he went shopping for men's clothes while he was wearing his wife's dress. And it was very, very embarrassing to him. It was written up in the newspapers, and he left kind of in that embarrassment back to New York, where he set up his podiatry practice again. But I thought that was kind of an interesting anecdote about him being robbed.
So he was an entrepreneur in addition to being a doctor. I mean, he did other things.
Oh, much so, yeah. As I said, when he first started out, he not only cut the toenails, he sold patent medicines.
So you also write that this was a fellow who was kind of a self-promoter. I mean, was such a puffery common to many whose work involved healing and surgery in an era before the AMA watched out for such marketing techniques? I mean, was that common for folks like this who began to get a reputation for performing these procedures and healing people?
Oh, very much so. There was a lot of puffery going on in those days. They would call themselves, there wasn't any licensing requirements to be called a doctor in those days, so anybody could be called a doctor, and many people did. Patent medicines would always, I shouldn't say always, but many times would list the doctors, so-and-so's medicine or whatever. An interesting thing about Issachar's supposed medical background, he claimed he had a medical degree from a college in Cuba. And the interesting thing is he didn't speak Spanish. So how he got that degree, nobody really questioned him on that. But he kept, this was some, thing that he would let people know. This is where he got his degree from. And in fact, there was a college in Cuba, but it didn't come into existence until long after he called himself a doctor and said he graduated from there. But yeah, that was very common. And, it's still common today. A lot of people lie about their resumes. You see that in the news all the time. Very prominent politicians, get caught out saying they did something, they served in the war or whatever. And this is, something that's been going on for a long time.
So we're talking about close to the middle of the 19th century. The Jewish population in this country was still relatively small. And there was clearly a lot of anti-Semitism out there. But one thing seems to be clear from what you write is that Zachary kind of made his way to the top and developed personal relationships with people of all faiths. How usual or unusual was that kind of camaraderie and being able to relate to people?
That was very, very unusual. There, as you said, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the United States at that time, and very often he would, in news reports, he would be referred to as Dr. Zachary the Jew. So there was that kind of background anti-Semitism that he had to deal with, but somehow he surmounted it, and he allied himself with Lincoln, who was a very, if you want to call it a philo Jewish person. He was very remarkable in that he didn't have these kind of prejudices that other people in the administration did. Some of his advisors, or some of the people in Congress, were very, very anti-Semitic. They would, Judah Benjamin was the other prominent Jew in the United States at that time. He was the Confederate Secretary of State, and when Northern politicians would refer to him, they would also always sort of have a anti-Semitic remark attached to his name. So yeah, there was a lot of anti-Semitism, but Zachary, he dealt with it as best he could.
Well, let's talk about Lincoln. And we had talked just before we went on this program about the historian Jonathan Sarna's book, Lincoln and the Jews. He also wrote a book about General Grant and the Jews, Ulysses S. Grant, President Grant and the Jews. There were a number of Jews in kind of concentric circles, if you will, that Lincoln either came into contact with or knew. And as you quite rightly point out, he was clearly philo-Semitic. His rescission of General Grant's General Order Number 11, Tennessee Department banning Jews from the Tennessee Department during the war, in the Civil War, of course, was just a landmark act by a president of the United States. It's certain there must have been some common ground here between the two, between Lincoln and Zachary, despite the obvious outward difference between the flamboyant Zachary and the humble President Lincoln. Do you think that the connection is there because they were both objects of scorn to some, or do you think it was just a chemistry issue? What was it that allowed this friendship to develop?
I think it was more a chemistry issue. They both had a sense of humor. Lincoln loved to tell jokes, and so did Zachary. And so they would, entertain one another, and kind of a bonhomie developed between the two of them, such that Zachary's making these frequent visits to the White House. And one of the news reports said he's one of the most frequent or favorite visitors at the White House. For some reason, and then people would scratch their head about this, he also got along with Mary, with whom very few people really related. So he had that going for him. And that must at least have allowed him to get into the White House to see Lincoln a lot more than other people would. An interesting anecdote, later on, long after Zachary's passed, a lot of writers, especially from the Wisconsin Jewish Journal, would write about Lincoln and Zachary. And one of them said that they used to enjoy a game of pinochle together.
Well, did he also treat Mary, or this was just simply a friendship because he knew?
No, he didn't treat. He's not known to have treated Mary at all. Although he had a few letters that he wrote to Lincoln in which he said, say hi to Mary, kind of thing.
And I mentioned Grant's General Order Number 11? Did that come up in any of your research in terms of?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned, Zachary was supposed to go down to see General Banks to be with him in New Orleans, and just about as he was about to leave, Grant issues this order saying that no Jews are going to be allowed into that territory. And despite what many think, Lincoln knew about this. And yet at that time, he didn't do anything. He just said, well, let's just wait. And then when things got out of hand, he eventually rescinded the order for prohibiting Jews to go into the territory. But Zachary didn't have anything to do with Lincoln rescinding that particular order. Although, as I said, Lincoln knew about it at the time and didn't do anything about it at the time it was issued. It was just a little bit later that he did so.
Yeah, there were actually a number of folks who entered into the picture protesting the order. And amongst them, there is a letter in the National Archives, the Library of Congress, from the Missouri Lodge of B'nai B'rith to President Lincoln, protesting this order. And of course, at the end of the story is a very positive one because he did rescind it. Later again, conferring with Lincoln, you write that Zachary traveled to Richmond to pursue a plan that he believed would end the war. What was the plan, and was it feasible as we look back in hindsight?
It wasn't much different from a plan that Lincoln originally proposed. He was going to compensate Southerners for releasing their slaves. He was going to pay them. That was one of Lincoln's original ideas. But Zachary wanted to go a little bit further. He was going to have the federal government assume the Confederate debt, so that they would get them out of any kind of financial straits that they would have been after the war. So it was those two kinds of arrangements that he was going to try and get the Confederate higher ups to agree to. And he actually met with Judah Benjamin, and they talked, but nothing obviously came of it.
It seems to me that to have this kind of ability to go out and to act in the president's name in a way, or maybe he felt that's what he was doing. Maybe he didn't get the actual green light to do so. It begs the question: how often, going back to Lincoln, how often would Zachary meet with?
There's I have in the book a number of occasions. I think we know about 3 or 4 actual ones where Lincoln actually mentions Zachary's my foot doctor and so and so, but there wasn't anybody transcribing the visits. They didn't keep a logbook of who was in there, who wasn't. You can imagine that from one of the news reports saying that he was the most favorite visitor at the White House. He was there quite often, but we don't know exactly how often.
So what happened to Zachary after Lincoln's assassination in the post-Civil War years? Where did he live? And what did he continue to do? What was his, did he just continue his practice? What happened to him after 1865?
Well, he did continue to do his practice in New York. He became very wealthy. He would be he used to be known as a gourmet and like an Elsa Lancaster character. He would give large parties for well-to-do people in New York, a very, very prominent person. But in the 1870s, 1880s, decided that he'd rather be back in England. His wife left before him, and he moved back to London, and he set up a prominent practice there. He was a mason, so he had his activities there, and he lived in England for the rest of his life. He had several children, many of whom, and I shouldn't say many, all of whom sort of had their own personal problems, and he had to deal with that. But after leaving the United States, he spent the rest of his life in London in a well-to-do community. He apparently was a very wealthy man at that time, and he lived out his life there. He died in, I think it was, if I remember right, 1900. And his wife died shortly thereafter.
Well, after his death, what was his reputation in the Jewish community, in the medical community, and what would you say were his most important contributions?
I think his most important contributions is, in hindsight, in us looking back, is this was when he used to call himself, he would call himself an Israelite. He wouldn't call himself a Jew. He called himself an Israelite. The idea that, and he said that an Israelite could rise to some of the most important unofficial positions, if not official positions, in the government, and he was sort of setting a precedent for other Jews to aspire to higher office, to higher attainment that they otherwise wouldn't have dreamt of. He sort of pioneered in getting himself to the top, getting himself to be able to interact with as high an individual as the president of the United States. And let me just go back for a second when you talk about Grant's order. Although Grant, is known for as an anti-Semitic because of that order, he tried to make amends in his presidency, and he tried to do as best he could to undo the kind of bitterness that he left behind. And in fact, Zachary, he was a patient of Zachary's, for instance. Zachary actually cut his nails.
Well, Jonathan Sarna, in his book about General Grant, speaks about that, how he did spend a good part of the rest of his life trying to make amends for what he did. And the connection of Zachary to Grant is interesting too. But did Zachary leave a memoir? Did he leave any kind of notes behind at all that after 1865 that spoke to his not only his life afterwards in England, but maybe reflecting on his years in the U.S. and being close to Lincoln and other important people?
No, he didn't, but he did leave behind. He wrote. I say write. He plagiarized several books, but that's not what we're talking about here. And he had this book of endorsements that he had from the various people that he treated, but he wasn't an introspective man in the sense that he left a diary or a journal or anything indicating his life or his background or what his ideas were. So no, he didn't leave any memoirs.
Well, the interesting thing is that about history is that no history can be completely told. There's always something new. And a new insight, a new angle, a new discovery. And, you've done that here, Ernest, with highlighting the life of an individual from the Jewish community who was clearly a confidant of our greatest president and the life that he led. And so you've really opened some new chapters into Civil War history that we hadn't known before. The book is Lincoln's Jewish Spy, The Life and Times of Issachar Zacharie by Ernest Abel. It's available in store or online wherever you purchase books. Really, we appreciate your being with us today. Thank you for speaking with us about your biography of Issachar Zacharie, which undoubtedly adds a new dimension to the story of Jews and the Civil War. Your book makes a compelling read for Civil War buffs. We're eager to learn about less well-known aspects of this history of the Civil War. And again, we're grateful that you could be here with us today.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Well, if you're looking for more of our diverse content, visit our website, b'nai.org, to listen to all of our conversations, podcasts, and live interviews. Tremendous thanks today to author and Civil War historian Ernest Abel for joining me, and thank you for listening in. If you like what you've heard, make sure you never miss an episode by tapping the subscribe button on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'm your host, Dan Mariaschin. Talk to you again soon. Take care, everyone.